Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers, where deep ideas meet restful nights. If you enjoy these journeys through philosophy, please like and subscribe and turn on notifications for daily uploads. To support the channel, consider leaving a super thanks. Any amount helps us continue creating content. You can also become a member to request video topics. We're not monetized, so your support truly makes the difference. Now let the philosophy begin. The Banach-Tarski paradox. A solid sphere can be decomposed into a finite number of pieces, which can then be reassembled, using only rotations and translations, to form two solid spheres, each identical to the original. And this seems to violate conservation of volume, seems to create matter from nothing, seems to be impossible. And yet, it is a theorem in mathematics, proven rigorously using the axiom of choice and the properties of infinite point sets. And this is the Banach-Tarski paradox, named after Stefan Banach and Alfred Tarski, who proved it in 1924. And the paradox reveals deep and counterintuitive features of infinite decompositions, of non-measurable sets, and of the relationship between mathematics and physical reality. The proof proceeds by decomposing the sphere into a finite number of pieces, typically 5 or 6, and each piece is a set of points, not a solid region with smooth boundaries but a scattered, disconnected, infinitely complex collection of points. And these pieces are non-measurable, meaning they do not have well-defined volumes in the usual sense. They cannot be assigned a size using standard measure theory, and this is crucial because measurable sets cannot be duplicated. Conservation of volume holds for measurable sets, but non-measurable sets escape this constraint. They can be rearranged in ways that seem to violate intuition, and the Banach-Tarski paradox exploits this by constructing pieces that are so pathological, so wildly scattered, that they can be rotated and translated to form two complete spheres. The decomposition uses the axiom of choice, the principle that given any collection of non-empty sets, there exists a way to choose one element from each set, and the axiom of choice is independent of the other axioms of set theory. It cannot be proven or disproven from the standard axioms, and some mathematicians reject it precisely because it leads to results, like the Banach-Tarski paradox, results that seem absurd, and rejecting the axiom of choice avoids the paradox. But it also cripples large parts of modern mathematics. Many important theorems depend on the axiom of choice, and most mathematicians accept it despite its counterintuitive consequences. The paradox applies only to objects in three-dimensional space, or higher. It does not work in 2 dimensions. A disk cannot be decomposed and reassembled into 2 disks, and this is because the group of rotations in the plane is amenable, meaning it admits a certain kind of averaging that prevents paradoxical decompositions, while the group of rotations in 3-dimensional space is non-amenable, and this non-amenability is what makes the Banach-Tarski paradox possible. The fact that rotations in 3 dimensions can be combined in ways that allow pieces to be moved around and duplicated. The paradox raises questions about the relationship between mathematical objects and physical objects, because while the Banach-Tarski theorem is mathematically rigorous, it does not imply that a physical sphere can be duplicated. The decomposition involves infinitely complex sets, pieces that are not solid regions but scattered collections of points, with no smooth boundaries, and such pieces cannot be physically realized, cannot be cut or manipulated, and so the paradox is a feature of mathematical idealizations rather than a claim about physical reality. And this distinction is important. The paradox shows that mathematical spheres treated as sets of points behave in strange ways, but it does not threaten conservation of mass or energy in physics, because physical objects are not sets of points but arrangements of atoms or fields or quantum states, and these are governed by physical laws that do not permit paradoxical duplication. Some mathematicians and philosophers argue that the Banach-Tarski paradox is not really a paradox but a theorem, a surprising result that reveals features of infinite point sets and non-measurable sets, and that calling it a paradox is misleading, suggesting contradiction when there is none, only counterintuitive behavior. And from this perspective, the paradox is valuable precisely because it challenges intuition, because it shows that infinite collections have properties that finite collections lack, that measure theory has limits, that the axiom of choice has strange consequences, and that mathematics is richer and stranger than naive expectations suggest. Others find the paradox troubling, a sign that something is wrong with the foundations, that the axiom of choice should be rejected or restricted, that non-measurable sets are pathological objects that should not be admitted into mathematics, and that theories which avoid such sets, like those based on constructive or intuitionistic logic, provide better foundations. And this debate reflects deeper disagreements about the nature of mathematical existence, about what kinds of objects mathematics should study, and about the role of intuition in guiding mathematical practice. The Banach-Tarski paradox also appears in discussions of probability and decision theory, because if a sphere can be decomposed into non-measurable pieces, then probability distributions on spheres must be carefully defined to avoid assigning probabilities to non-measurable sets. And this technical requirement reflects the same underlying issue, that not all collections of points can be measured, that probability requires measurability, and that attempting to assign probabilities to arbitrary sets leads to contradictions or paradoxes. The sphere sits on the table, solid and indivisible to the eye, but mathematically it is a set of infinitely many points. And the Banach-Tarski theorem says that these points can be partitioned into pieces, 5 or 6 strange scattered collections, and these pieces can be moved, rotated and translated and reassembled into 2 spheres, identical to the original. And the volume has doubled, or seems to have doubled, but the pieces never had well-defined volumes. They were never measurable, and so nothing has been created, no conservation law has been violated, only the intuition that decomposition preserves size, and this intuition holds for finite decompositions, for measurable pieces, but fails for infinite non-measurable pieces, and the paradox endures. A theorem that sounds impossible, a result that challenges understanding, a demonstration that mathematics contains surprises, that infinity is stranger than imagination, that point sets behave in ways that solid objects do not, and that the axiom of choice, innocent as it seems, permits constructions that defy common sense, and the sphere duplicates, mathematically, if not physically. And the paradox remains a permanent fixture in the landscape of mathematics, a result that students encounter with disbelief, that mathematicians accept as rigorous yet counterintuitive, and that philosophers debate as revealing something deep about the nature of mathematical objects, about the limits of measure theory, about the relationship between infinite idealization and finite reality. And the sphere sits there, unchanged and yet somehow doubled, a monument to the strangeness of infinity, to the power of the axiom of choice, and to the capacity of mathematics to prove truths that seem like impossibilities. The card paradox. Imagine a card, simple and rectangular, lying flat on a table, and on one side is written a single sentence. The statement on the other side of this card is true, and already the mind begins to sense danger, a trap being set. The card is flipped over, and on the reverse side another sentence appears. The statement on the other side of this card is false. And now the contradiction is complete. A perfect loop of mutual negation that cannot be resolved no matter how many times the card is turned. If the first side is true, then the second side must be true, as the first side claims, but if the second side is true, then the first side must be false, as the second side claims, which contradicts the assumption that the first side is true. And if the first side is false, then the second side must be false, as the first side incorrectly claims it is true. But if the second side is false, then the first side must be true, as the second side incorrectly claims it is false. and the cycle spirals endlessly without rest. The card paradox is a variation of the liar paradox, but its physical form makes the contradiction feel more tangible, more concrete, a paradox that can be held in the hand and turned over and over as if repetition might somehow reveal a hidden answer that logic cannot provide. The paradox demonstrates how self-reference can be distributed across multiple statements rather than contained in a single sentence, showing that contradictions do not need to be immediate or obvious to be genuine, that they can emerge from relationships between statements rather than from the statements themselves. Philip Jourdan, a mathematician and logician, is often credited with popularizing this version of the paradox in the early 20th century, using it to explore the limits of truth and reference, and to illustrate the kinds of problems that plagued attempts to formalize logic and mathematics during that era. The card paradox also reveals something about the nature of truth itself, the way that truth is not a property that statements possess in isolation, but a relationship between statements and the world, or between statements and other statements. And when those relationships form closed loops, the concept of truth begins to break down. Some philosophers argue that the statements on the card are neither true nor false, but meaningless, that they fail to refer to anything outside themselves and therefore do not qualify as genuine propositions, while others suggest that the paradox exposes a flaw in the classical assumption that every statement must be either true or false, that perhaps some statements occupy a third category, undefined or indeterminate. The card sits on the table, innocent and menacing, a small object that contains an infinite problem, and no amount of flipping will resolve what is written on its surfaces. No clever interpretation will untangle the knot, and so it remains, a monument to the limits of language and logic, a reminder that not all questions have answers, that some truths are forever out of reach, caught in loops that reason cannot break. The Bell spaceship paradox. When two rockets pull a string apart, two identical spaceships float in space, separated by some distance, let us say 1 kilometer measured in their initial rest frame, and a thin thread connects the two ships, stretched taut but not under tension, and now both ships fire their rockets simultaneously, both accelerating at exactly the same rate, both reaching the same velocity at the same time as measured in the original rest frame. And the question arises, what happens to the thread? Does it break or does it remain intact? And the paradox is that two different lines of reasoning seem to give opposite answers. One argument says the thread remains intact because both ships accelerate identically and maintain constant separation in the original rest frame, while another argument says the thread must break because of length contraction, and this is Bell's spaceship paradox, proposed by physicist John Stuart Bell to clarify misconceptions about special relativity and the nature of length contraction. Consider the first argument. In the original rest frame, both ships start 1 kilometer apart, and both ships accelerate at the same rate, their velocities remaining equal at all times, and so the distance between them, as measured in the original rest frame, remains 1 kilometer throughout the acceleration. The ships maintain constant separation as measured by rulers at rest in the original frame, and the thread, stretched between the ships, also spans 1 kilometer in this frame. And if the separation does not change, then why would the thread break? It experiences no increased tension, no stretching, and so the thread should remain intact. And this reasoning seems compelling, seems to follow directly from the symmetry of the situation. But now consider the second argument, from the perspective of someone accelerating with the ships, someone in the instantaneous rest frame of the spaceships at any given moment. And in this frame, the distance between the ships is undergoing length contraction relative to the original frame. The proper distance between the ships, the distance measured by a ruler moving with the ships, is greater than 1 kilometer, and growing, because the ships are maintaining constant coordinate separation in the original frame, while length contraction says that moving objects are contracted, And so to maintain constant coordinate separation in the original frame, the proper separation must increase, must stretch, and the thread, a physical object with a rest length, cannot stretch indefinitely without breaking, and so the thread must snap as the proper distance between the ships increases beyond the thread's breaking point. Bell's answer, and the correct answer according to relativity, is that the thread breaks. The second argument is correct, and the error in the first argument is subtle. It confuses coordinate distance in the original rest frame with proper distance measured by moving rulers. And length contraction does not mean that objects physically shrink in their own rest frame. It means that the relationship between coordinate distance in one frame and proper distance in another frame involves a contraction factor, and when two ships maintain constant coordinate separation in the original frame while accelerating, they are actually increasing their proper separation, the distance measured by rulers that move with them, and the thread, stretched between the ships, experiences this increasing proper separation as tension, and eventually the tension exceeds the thread's strength and it breaks. Imagine the situation more concretely. Place a series of markers at rest in the original frame, spaced 1 meter apart, stretching from the first ship to the second ship, and initially there are 1,000 markers spanning the 1 kilometer between the ships. And now the ships accelerate, and at any given instant in the original frame, the ships remain at the same markers they started at. The distance between them measured by these markers remains 1,000 meters, but from the perspective of the moving ships, the markers are getting closer together, are contracting, because the markers are in motion relative to the ships, and so the ships see more and more markers passing between them. The number of markers spanning the gap increases, and this means the proper distance between the ships is increasing, and the thread, which has a fixed rest length, cannot span this increasing proper distance, and it breaks. The paradox reveals a common misconception about special relativity, the idea that if two objects start with a certain separation and undergo identical accelerations, then they must maintain the same separation, but this is false. Maintaining the same coordinate separation in one frame requires increasing proper separation when the objects are accelerating, and this is because acceleration is not relative in the way velocity is. Accelerating objects experience forces, have proper accelerations that can be measured by accelerometers on board, and two spaceships with identical proper accelerations do not maintain constant proper separation. They drift apart in their own instantaneous rest frames. Bell used this paradox to clarify that length contraction is a real physical effect, not merely a coordinate artifact or an optical illusion. The thread really breaks. Real physical forces are involved, and the contraction of moving objects is a consequence of how electromagnetic forces between atoms transform under Lorentz boosts. And these forces are what hold matter together, what give objects their rigidity, and when objects accelerate, the forces adjust. And in the Bell spaceship scenario, the adjustment causes the thread to experience tension and eventually to snap. The paradox also connects to the Ehrenfest paradox, another puzzle in special relativity involving rotation and length contraction, where a disk spinning at relativistic speeds seems to have a contracted circumference but unchanged radius, leading to apparent contradictions with Euclidean geometry. And both paradoxes illustrate that accelerated motion introduces subtleties that are not present in inertial motion, that naive applications of length contraction can lead to errors, and that careful analysis using the full machinery of special relativity is required to get the right answers. Visualize the two spaceships accelerating in lockstep, their separation constant as measured by observers at rest, but the thread between them stretching from the ship's perspective, growing taut, fibers straining and eventually snapping, breaking in the middle, the two halves trailing behind each ship, and the observers at rest see the thread break. Even though the ships never changed their coordinate separation, and this breaking is real, is frame independent. All observers agree that the thread broke. Though they may disagree about why, about what forces were involved, but the physical fact of the breaking is invariant, is an event in spacetime that everyone can observe. Bell's spaceship paradox remains a challenging problem in relativity pedagogy. Many students, and even some physicists, initially get it wrong, arguing that the thread should not break, and the paradox serves as a test of whether someone truly understands length contraction and the relativity of simultaneity, whether they can correctly apply these concepts to accelerating objects. And the paradox has generated extensive discussion in physics journals, with papers clarifying the resolution and exploring variations. And it stands as a reminder that special relativity, despite being over a century old, still contains subtleties that require careful thought, that intuitions about space and time must be constantly checked against the formalism, and that even seemingly simple scenarios can hide deep complexities. The rockets fire, the ships accelerate, maintaining constant spacing in the original frame, and the thread stretches, taut and straining, and then snaps, unable to bridge the growing proper distance. And Bell's paradox resolves, the thread breaks, relativity vindicated, and the lesson learned, that acceleration changes things, that maintaining coordinate separation requires increasing proper separation, that length contraction is real and physical, and that relativity continues to surprise, continues to challenge intuition, continues to reward careful analysis with deeper understanding of how space and time and motion interweave to create the strange but consistent fabric of relativistic physics. The boy or girl paradox. A family has 2 children, and you're told that at least one of them is a boy, and the question is posed, what is the probability that both children are boys? And the intuitive answer is 1/2, because the other child is either a boy or a girl with equal probability, but this reasoning is incorrect. The actual probability is 1/3, and this is the boy or girl paradox, a puzzle in conditional probability that has generated confusion and debate for decades, with different versions yielding different answers depending on exactly how the information is obtained and what assumptions are made about the selection process. The solution proceeds by considering all possible, equally likely combinations of 2 children. There are 4 possibilities: boy-boy, boy-girl, girl-boy, girl-girl, and girl-girl, where the order matters because the first child and second child are distinct, even if both are boys or both are girls. And if we are told that at least one child is a boy, then the girl-girl possibility is eliminated, leaving 3 equally likely cases: boy-boy, boy-girl, and girl-boy. And only in one of these 3 cases are both children boys, and so the probability is 1/3, not 1/2. The paradox arises because the conditioning statement, at least one is a boy, is not the same as knowing the gender of a specific child. If instead we are told that the older child is a boy, or the younger child is a boy, then the probability that both are boys becomes 1/2, because we are conditioning on a specific child being a boy rather than on the existential claim that at least one child somewhere in the family is a boy. And this distinction, subtle as it seems, makes a crucial difference to the probability calculation. The boy or girl paradox has many variations that probe the boundaries of the problem and reveal how sensitive the answer is to the exact specification of the scenario. One famous variant involves meeting a man who says he has 2 children, and one of them is a boy named Tuesday, meaning the boy was born on a Tuesday, and this additional information about the day of the week changes the probabilities in a surprising way, because it reduces the number of scenarios consistent with the statement, and the probability that both children are boys increases from 1/3 to 13/27. And this result seems bizarre, seems like the day of the week should be irrelevant, but the mathematics is sound. The additional specificity affects the conditional probabilities. Another variation asks, what if you meet a man with 2 children, and you see one of them, a boy? Does this change the answer? And the answer is yes. Seeing a specific boy is different from being told that at least one child is a boy, because seeing introduces selection effects. You are more likely to see a boy in families with 2 boys than in families with 1 boy, and so the probability calculation must account for the process by which the information was obtained, and different processes lead to different answers. And this sensitivity to selection effects is a general feature of conditional probability problems. And it explains why the boy or girl paradox has multiple defensible answers depending on the scenario. The paradox connects to the reference class problem and to debates about the principle of indifference, because applying the principle of indifference requires specifying a reference class, a set of equally likely outcomes, and different choices of reference class lead to different probability assignments. And in the boy or girl paradox, the reference class could be families with at least 1 boy, or it could be situations where someone tells you that at least 1 child is a boy. And these are different reference classes with different probabilities. And there is no neutral or obvious way to choose between them without more information about how the scenario is set up. The paradox also raises questions about the interpretation of probability statements in natural language, because phrases like "at least one is a boy" can be interpreted in different ways, as a statement about the existence of a boy in the family, as a statement about what someone knows or has observed, or as a statement about what information has been communicated, and each interpretation leads to different formal models and different probability calculations. And this ambiguity in natural language is a source of many probability paradoxes, where the mathematical answer depends on details that are not fully specified in the informal statement of the problem. Bayesian statisticians and frequentists also interpret the paradox differently. Bayesians treat probability as degrees of belief and calculate conditional probabilities using Bayes' theorem, while frequentists treat probability as long-run frequencies and may question whether the conditional probability is well defined without specifying a clear sampling procedure. And these different philosophical approaches to probability lead to different emphases in how the paradox is understood and resolved, though both traditions agree on the mathematical calculations once the problem is precisely formulated. The boy or girl paradox has practical analogues in genetics and medicine, where the probability of certain conditions depends on family history in ways that are similar to the structure of the paradox. For instance, the probability that a family carries a recessive genetic trait depends on how many children are observed to have the trait, and the calculations must account for ascertainment bias, the fact that families are more likely to come to medical attention if they have affected children, and this bias affects the probability assessments in ways that parallel the selection effects in the boy or girl paradox. The family walks down the street, 2 children beside them, and you know that at least one is a boy, and the question remains, what is the probability that both are boys? And the answer depends on how you came to know this fact, on whether you asked about a specific child or about any child, on whether you saw a boy or were merely told that at least one exists, and each variation of the scenario changes the answer, shifts the probabilities, reveals that conditional probability is sensitive to context, to process, to the mechanisms by which information is acquired and communicated, and the paradox persists as a puzzle, as a teaching tool, as a demonstration of how subtle probability can be, how carefully problems must be formulated, how easily intuition can mislead. And the boy walks ahead, evidence of his existence, shifting probabilities, conditioning beliefs, and the mathematics unfolds, precise and unforgiving, calculating 1/3 or 1/2 or 13/27, depending on the details, and the intuition struggles to keep up, struggles to grasp why the day of the week matters, why seeing is different from being told, why reference classes and selection effects have such profound impacts on what should be simple questions, and the paradox endures unsettled in the sense that people continue to disagree about which answer is correct for which version, continue to debate whether the problem is well posed, continue to find new variations that test the boundaries of conditional probability, and the family continues walking. The boy or boys or boy and girl continue existing, and the question remains open, answerable only when the scenario is specified with enough precision to eliminate ambiguity, to fix the reference class, to determine the selection process, and until then, the paradox lives on. A reminder that probability is not just mathematics, but interpretation. Not just calculation, but careful attention to how information is obtained, how questions are asked, and how evidence is generated. The blind sight paradox. Why some blind people can see without seeing. A patient suffers damage to the primary visual cortex, the region of the brain that processes visual information and produces conscious visual experience. And the damage is severe, destroys the tissue completely, and the patient reports being blind, reports seeing nothing, experiencing only darkness in the affected visual field, and vision tests confirm the blindness. The patient cannot identify objects placed in the blind region, cannot read letters, cannot describe colours or shapes, and by every standard clinical measure, the patient has lost vision in that part of their visual field. And yet something strange occurs. Experimenters place objects in the blind field and ask the patient to guess where they are, to point at them even though the patient cannot see them, and the patient protests, says this is pointless, says there is nothing to see, but when forced to guess, the patient points accurately, reaches correctly, identifies the location, and sometimes even the nature of objects at levels far above chance. And this ability, this capacity to respond to visual information without conscious visual experience is called blind sight, and it creates a paradox. The patient is both blind and not blind, both lacks vision and has vision, lacks conscious sight but retains unconscious visual processing. And this dissociation between conscious experience and information processing challenges our understanding of perception, challenges the relationship between consciousness and function, and raises questions about what vision is, whether seeing requires awareness, whether perception requires experience. And this is the blind sight paradox, a phenomenon that reveals that consciousness can be separated from processing, that the brain can use information without the person experiencing it. Imagine the blind sight patient's perspective, looking straight ahead, and part of the visual field is normal, contains conscious visual experience, objects and colours and shapes, and another part is blank, is darkness, is absence of experience, and experimenters place an object in the blind region, a ball perhaps, and ask where it is, and the patient says, I don't know, I can't see anything there. And the experimenter says, just guess, point to where you think it is, and the patient reluctantly points, randomly it seems. And yet the pointing is accurate, is directed toward the ball, and the patient is surprised. Says it was just a lucky guess, has no feeling of seeing, no visual experience that guided the response, and yet the accuracy persists, trial after trial. And the paradox is that the patient is using visual information, is processing it, is responding to it, but is not conscious of it, is not experiencing it. And vision has split into two components, conscious experience and information processing. And these normally go together, but in blind sight they come apart. The blind sight phenomenon has been documented in multiple patients, studied extensively, and the mechanism involves intact pathways from the eye to brain regions outside the primary visual cortex. Pathways that process visual information for action and navigation without producing conscious experience. And these pathways allow blind sight patients to respond to visual stimuli without seeing them. And the existence of these pathways shows that vision is not a single unified process, but involves multiple systems, some conscious and some unconscious. And damage to visual cortex eliminates conscious vision, but leaves unconscious visual processing intact. And this dissociation reveals something fundamental about consciousness, shows that information processing is not sufficient for conscious experience, that the brain can process and use information without that information becoming conscious. Visualize vision as having multiple components. One component processes information for conscious perception, for seeing in the ordinary sense, for having visual experiences, and another component processes information for action, for guiding behavior, for spatial navigation. And normally these components work together, are integrated, and we do not notice the distinction. But in blind sight, they separate. One component is destroyed while the other remains, and the patient has action vision without perceptual vision, can use visual information for pointing and reaching, but cannot experience that information, cannot see it. And this shows that conscious experience is not simply a byproduct of information processing, but is a specific kind of processing, localized in specific brain regions. And when those regions are damaged, consciousness is lost even though other forms of visual processing continue. The blind sight paradox challenges functionalist theories of consciousness. Theories that say consciousness is defined by functional roles, by what information does, by how it affects behavior, because in blind sight, visual information performs many of its normal functions, guides behavior, enables responses, but does not produce conscious experience. And so consciousness is not identical to function, is something additional, is a specific kind of processing beyond mere responsiveness to stimuli. And this supports theories that distinguish between access consciousness, the availability of information for cognitive processes, and phenomenal consciousness, the subjective experiential quality. And blind sight shows that these can come apart, that information can be accessed and used without being phenomenally conscious. One response to the blind sight paradox accepts that it shows consciousness is separate from certain functions, from certain kinds of information processing, but argues that this does not threaten physicalism, does not show that consciousness is non-physical, only that it is a specific physical process localized in specific brain regions. And blind sight is a case where some visual processing continues without the processing that produces conscious experience, and this is compatible with consciousness being physical, being identical to certain patterns of neural activity. And the paradox shows which patterns are necessary for consciousness, shows that primary visual cortex is essential, and this is progress in understanding the neural correlates of consciousness. Another response questions whether blind sight patients truly lack conscious experience, argues that they might have degraded or partial visual experiences that they do not recognize as vision, that do not match their expectations of what seeing should feel like. And when they say they see nothing, they mean they have no clear, vivid visual experience, but they might have vague feelings, subtle impressions that guide their guesses, and these impressions might be minimal forms of consciousness rather than pure unconscious processing. And this response denies the complete dissociation, argues that some phenomenology remains in blind sight even if it is not ordinary visual phenomenology. A third response embraces the paradox as revealing that consciousness is not necessary for many cognitive functions, that unconscious processing is far more powerful than we thought, that the mind operates largely without awareness and consciousness is only the tip of the iceberg, a small subset of mental processes. And blind sight is an extreme case, but similar dissociations occur in normal cognition, where we process information, make decisions, guide behavior without conscious awareness. And the paradox shows that consciousness, rather than being essential to cognition, is a specialized feature that occurs only in certain conditions, for certain kinds of information processing. The blind sight paradox also has implications for debates about animal consciousness, about which animals are conscious, because if information processing without consciousness is possible in humans, then it might be the norm in simpler animals. Animals might respond to stimuli, navigate environments, exhibit complex behaviors without having conscious experiences, without there being anything it is like to be them. And this makes determining animal consciousness more difficult, makes behavioral evidence insufficient, because behavior can be produced by unconscious processing, as blindsight demonstrates. The patient sits in the laboratory, the blind field tested again and again, and each time the accuracy surprises, the pointing succeeds, the guessing is correct, and the patient insists they see nothing, feel nothing, experience nothing in that region, and yet the information is there, is being used, is guiding behavior, and the paradox persists. Vision without seeing, processing without experience, function without phenomenology, and the blind sight paradox remains one of the most important phenomena in consciousness research, a real-world demonstration that conscious experience and information processing can dissociate, that the brain can use information the person does not consciously access, and that consciousness is not reducible to function, is something specific, something localized, something that can be lost while other aspects of vision remain. And the phenomenon continues to challenge theories of consciousness, continues to provide evidence about the neural basis of awareness, and continues to raise questions about what consciousness is, what purposes it serves, why it exists, and whether it is necessary for cognition or is instead a luxury, an addition, something that happens only when certain brain regions process information in certain ways. And the blindsight patient reaches into darkness and touches the object, accurate despite seeing nothing, and the paradox endures. The Ellsberg paradox. An urn contains 90 balls, 30 of which are red, and 60 of which are some mix of black and yellow, but the exact proportions of black and yellow are unknown. The 60 non-red balls could be all black, all yellow, or any combination, and you are offered a series of bets, and the choices you face reveal a pattern of preferences that violates the standard axioms of rational decision theory. And this is the Ellsberg paradox, named after Daniel Ellsberg, who presented it in 1961. And the paradox demonstrates that people systematically prefer known probabilities to unknown probabilities, exhibiting what is called ambiguity aversion, a tendency to avoid situations where the probabilities are uncertain, and this preference pattern cannot be accommodated by expected utility theory, which requires that rational agents have well-defined subjective probabilities for all events and choose actions that maximize expected utility, calculated using these probabilities. The first bet involves choosing between two options. Bet A pays if a red ball is drawn, and bet B pays if a black ball is drawn. And most people prefer bet A, preferring to bet on red, where the probability is known to be 30 out of 90, 1/3, rather than betting on black, where the probability is unknown, could be anything from 0 to 60 out of 90. And this preference seems reasonable, seems to reflect a cautious attitude toward uncertainty, a desire to avoid ambiguity. The second bet offers a choice between bet C, which pays if a red or yellow ball is drawn, and bet D, which pays if a black or yellow ball is drawn, and most people prefer bet D, preferring to bet on black or yellow, where the combined probability is known to be 60 out of 90, 2/3, rather than betting on red or yellow, where the probability depends on the unknown proportion of yellow balls. The paradox emerges when these two preferences are combined, because preferring bet A to bet B suggests that the person believes red is more likely than black, that they implicitly assign a higher subjective probability to red, and preferring bet D to bet C suggests that they believe black or yellow is more likely than red or yellow, which implies that black is more likely than red. And these two beliefs are contradictory. If red is more likely than black, then red or yellow should be more likely than black or yellow, given that both involve adding the same unknown proportion of yellow. And so the preference pattern violates the sure thing principle, the axiom that if you prefer X to Y when some event E occurs, and you also prefer X to Y when E does not occur, then you should prefer X to Y unconditionally, regardless of whether you know whether E occurred. The Ellsberg paradox cannot be explained by standard subjective probability theory because any consistent assignment of subjective probabilities to red, black, and yellow would make the preference for A over B incompatible with the preference for D over C. And so the pattern reveals that people do not have well-defined subjective probabilities for ambiguous events, or that they do not maximize expected utility using those probabilities, and instead they exhibit a preference for known over unknown probabilities, a violation of the completeness axiom of decision theory, which requires that agents must be able to compare all options and have a preference or be indifferent between them. Ellsberg's paradox has inspired alternative decision theories that can accommodate ambiguity aversion, including maximum expected utility theory, where agents consider multiple possible probability distributions consistent with their knowledge and choose the action that maximizes expected utility under the worst-case distribution, effectively being pessimistic about ambiguity, and Choquet expected utility theory, where probabilities are replaced with capacities that need not be additive, allowing for a richer representation of uncertainty, and multiple priors models, where agents maintain a set of probability distributions rather than a single prior, and use decision rules that reflect their attitudes toward this multiplicity. The paradox also connects to debates about rationality and the normative status of decision-theoretic axioms. Some argue that the Ellsberg preferences are irrational, that they reflect cognitive biases or errors in reasoning, and that ideal rational agents would not exhibit ambiguity aversion, would assign consistent subjective probabilities and maximize expected utility, while others argue that ambiguity aversion is perfectly rational, that it reflects a reasonable response to ignorance, that known risks are genuinely different from unknown risks, and that the axioms of expected utility theory, while mathematically elegant, do not capture all aspects of rational decision-making. The paradox has practical implications for economics and finance, because ambiguity aversion affects how people make decisions under uncertainty, how they invest in markets where probabilities are unknown, how they value insurance and options, how they respond to new technologies with uncertain risks. And understanding ambiguity aversion helps explain behaviors that seem puzzling from a standard expected utility perspective, such as the home bias in portfolio choice, where investors prefer domestic assets over foreign assets even when expected returns are higher abroad, and the equity premium puzzle, where the observed returns on stocks are much higher than on bonds, suggesting that investors demand large premiums for bearing ambiguous risks. The urn sits on the table, 90 balls inside, 30 red and 60 mixed, and you must choose, and the choices seem reasonable, seem to reflect a natural caution about the unknown, but the pattern of choices violates the axioms of rational decision theory, reveals a preference structure that cannot be represented by subjective probabilities, and the paradox forces a choice: either accept that the preferences are irrational and should be corrected, or accept that the theory is incomplete and should be extended, and neither option is comfortable. Neither satisfies the desire for a simple unified theory of rational choice. And so the Ellsberg paradox remains a challenge to orthodoxy, a puzzle that resists easy resolution, a demonstration that human decision-making is more complex than the elegant mathematics of expected utility suggests, and the ambiguity persists. The unknown proportions of black and yellow remain unknown, and we choose as we must, preferring the known to the unknown, preferring certainty to ambiguity, and the theory struggles to accommodate this preference, struggles to explain why it should be rational or how it can be consistent, and the paradox endures, unsolved, unresolved, a permanent thorn in the side of decision theory. A reminder that rationality is contested, that formal models capture some aspects of decision-making but not all, and that the gap between theory and behavior, between what axioms demand and what people do may reflect not irrationality, but the inadequacy of the axioms themselves. And the urn waits, the balls wait, the choice waits, and we must decide, knowing some probabilities but not others. And the decision reveals something about us, about how we value knowledge and fear ignorance, about whether ambiguity is just another form of risk or something fundamentally different. And the paradox lingers, unresolved, unsettled, a puzzle that decision theory has not yet tamed. The EPR paradox, when particles know what their partners are doing. Two particles are created together in a quantum process, perhaps two photons emitted from a single atom, or two electrons produced in a pair, and these particles fly apart in opposite directions, travelling far from each other, perhaps to opposite ends of a laboratory, or even to different planets. And quantum mechanics predicts that these particles remain connected, entangled, in a way that defies classical intuition, because measuring a property of one particle instantly affects the other particle, no matter how far apart they are, and the measurement outcomes are correlated in ways that cannot be explained by assuming each particle carried definite properties from the beginning. And this is the EPR paradox, named after Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen, who presented it in 1935 as an argument that quantum mechanics is incomplete, that there must be hidden variables, additional information not captured by the quantum wave function that determines the outcomes of measurements and explains the correlations without requiring instantaneous action at a distance. Imagine the scenario more concretely. Two particles are entangled such that they have opposite spins. If one is measured to have spin up, then the other will definitely be measured to have spin down, and vice versa. And this correlation is perfect, 100%, whenever both particles are measured along the same axis. And before measurement, quantum mechanics describes each particle as being in a superposition of spin up and spin down, neither definite. And the two particles together are described by an entangled state that cannot be factored into separate descriptions of each particle. The state is inherently joint, and when one particle is measured and found to be spin up, the other particle's state immediately becomes spin down, even if the two particles are light years apart. And this instantaneous correlation troubled Einstein, who called it spooky action at a distance, and argued that it violated the principle of locality, the idea that physical influences cannot travel faster than light, that distant events cannot have immediate effects. Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen proposed that quantum mechanics is incomplete, that each particle must carry hidden information, hidden variables that determine what the measurement outcomes will be, and these hidden variables are fixed at the moment the particles are created. And so when the particles are measured later, the outcomes are determined by these pre-existing properties, not by any instantaneous influence. And the correlation between the particles is explained by the fact that they started with correlated hidden variables, like two coins that were both set to heads when they left your hand and remain heads as they fly through the air. And when you look at them later, you find them both showing heads. And this correlation does not require any spooky action, just common initial conditions. And EPR argued that quantum mechanics, which does not include these hidden variables, gives an incomplete description of reality. For decades, the EPR argument was a philosophical debate, a question about interpretation and the nature of quantum mechanics. But in 1964, physicist John Bell proved a theorem that transformed the debate into an experimental question. Bell showed that any theory based on local hidden variables, any theory where measurement outcomes are determined by pre-existing properties and where influences travel at or below the speed of light, must satisfy certain mathematical inequalities, now called Bell inequalities, and these inequalities place limits on how strongly the measurement outcomes of two distant particles can be correlated. And Bell showed that quantum mechanics predicts correlations that violate these inequalities, that quantum correlations are stronger than any local hidden variable theory can produce. And so by performing experiments and measuring the correlations, one can test whether nature obeys the Bell inequalities, and if the inequalities are violated, then local hidden variables are ruled out, and quantum mechanics, with its spooky action at a distance, is vindicated. Experiments have been performed many times with increasing sophistication and precision, closing various loopholes, and the results consistently show violations of Bell inequalities, strong correlations that match quantum mechanical predictions, and rule out local hidden variable theories. And so nature does not obey locality in the way Einstein wanted. The particles really are entangled, and measuring one really does instantaneously affect the other. And this is now an established experimental fact, one of the most thoroughly tested predictions in physics, and the EPR paradox has been resolved in favour of quantum mechanics against Einstein's intuitions, though the philosophical implications remain deeply puzzling. The paradox forces a choice between giving up locality or giving up realism, the idea that physical properties have definite values independent of measurement, and most interpretations of quantum mechanics give up realism, accepting that particles do not have definite spin values until measured, that the spin only becomes definite through the act of measurement, and the entanglement means that the two particles are not independent. They form a single quantum system even when separated by vast distances, and measuring one particle provides information about the system as a whole, and this information is reflected in the state of the other particle. But this does not allow faster-than-light communication, because the measurement outcomes are random. Neither particle can control what value it will be measured to have, and so no message can be sent. Only correlations can be observed after the fact by comparing measurement records. Some interpretations of quantum mechanics, like Bohmian mechanics, preserve realism by giving up locality, introducing non-local hidden variables that allow instantaneous influences, pilot waves that guide particles in ways that depend on the entire configuration of the universe. And these theories reproduce the predictions of quantum mechanics and are empirically equivalent, but they are non-local. They violate Einstein's principle that influences cannot propagate faster than light. And most physicists find this cost too high, prefer to accept that realism must be given up, that particles do not have definite properties until measured. Visualize the two entangled particles flying apart, one heading left and one heading right, and they are described by a single wave function, an entangled state that says, if left is up, then right is down, and if left is down, then right is up, but neither is definite until measured. And now imagine measuring the left particle and finding it spin up, and at that instant, even though the right particle is far away, its state changes. It becomes definitely spin down, and if someone measures the right particle immediately after, they will definitely find spin down. And this correlation holds no matter how far apart the particles are, no matter how quickly the measurements are performed, as long as they are performed along the same axis. And this instantaneous correlation cannot be explained by assuming the particles carry definite spins from the beginning. Bell's theorem proves that, and so the correlation is genuinely quantum, genuinely non-local, genuinely spooky. And yet it does not allow signaling, does not allow information to be sent faster than light, because the outcomes are random and cannot be controlled. The EPR paradox stands as one of the deepest puzzles in quantum mechanics, a paradox that led to Bell's theorem, to decades of experimental tests, to the confirmation of quantum non-locality, and to ongoing debates about what quantum mechanics means, about whether reality is fundamentally non-local, about whether measurement is a special process or an ordinary interaction, about whether consciousness plays a role, about whether the universe splits into branches or whether hidden variables exist beyond our current theories, and none of these questions has a settled answer. Different physicists and philosophers hold different views, and the EPR paradox remains a touchstone, a thought experiment that crystallizes the central mysteries of quantum theory. And Einstein's discomfort with spooky action at a distance his belief that quantum mechanics must be incomplete has been answered by experiment. Nature really is spooky. Particles really are entangled. Measurements really do have instantaneous non-local effects. And this is not a failure of the theory, but a feature of reality, a feature that defies classical intuition and forces us to accept that the quantum world operates according to rules that seem impossible, that violate locality, that create correlations stronger than any classical mechanism can produce. And the paradox endures, not as an unsolved problem, but as a solved problem with an unsettling answer. And the particles fly apart, entangled forever, connected by invisible quantum threads, and measuring one affects the other instantly, across any distance, and the universe is non-local. And the EPR paradox, intended to show that quantum mechanics is incomplete, instead revealed that nature is stranger than Einstein imagined. The coastline paradox, why no one can agree how long Britain's shore is. A mapmaker sits down to measure the length of the coastline of Great Britain, the perimeter of the island, the total distance around its shores. And this seems like a straightforward task, a matter of careful measurement and calculation. But the paradox is that the answer depends on the scale of measurement, on how closely you look, on what size ruler you use to trace the coast. And as the ruler gets smaller, as the measurement becomes more precise, the measured length increases without bound, growing larger and larger, approaching infinity. And so the coastline has no well-defined length, or rather, its length is infinite. Or rather, the question of length becomes meaningless for highly irregular shapes. And this is the coastline paradox, first articulated clearly by mathematician Benoit Mandelbrot, who used it to motivate the study of fractals, shapes that exhibit self-similarity and complexity at all scales. Imagine measuring the coastline with a 100-kilometer ruler, a straight stick 100 kilometers long, and you walk around the island placing the stick end to end, measuring each straight segment. And when you reach the starting point, you add up all the segments and get a total length, perhaps 4,000 kilometers, and this seems like a reasonable measurement. But now imagine using a 10-kilometer ruler instead, a shorter stick. And because the ruler is shorter, it can follow the bends and curves of the coast more closely. It does not cut across bays and headlands, but traces around them. And when you complete the circuit, the total length is longer, perhaps 5,000 kilometers, because the shorter ruler captures more detail, more twists and turns, that the longer ruler missed. And now imagine using a 1-kilometer ruler, even shorter, and it follows the coast even more closely, entering smaller inlets, tracing around individual rocks and peninsulas, and the measured length increases again, perhaps to 7,000 kilometers. Continue this process using shorter and shorter rulers, a 100-meter ruler, a 10-meter ruler, a 1-meter ruler, and each time the measured length increases, because each shorter ruler reveals new details, new irregularities, new ins and outs that the previous ruler smoothed over, and the coastline is fractal-like, exhibiting structure at every scale. Every time you zoom in, you find new complexity, new bays within bays, new peninsulas jutting from peninsulas. And so there is no scale at which the coast becomes smooth, no level of detail at which further refinement stops revealing new length. And if you continue to arbitrarily small rulers, measuring every pebble, every grain of sand, every molecule, the measured length grows without limit, approaching infinity. And so the coastline paradox concludes that the coastline has infinite length, or more carefully, that the concept of length as traditionally defined does not apply to highly irregular curves like coastlines. Mandelbrot used this paradox to introduce fractals, geometric shapes characterized by self-similarity and non-integer dimension. And he showed that coastlines, along with many other natural shapes like clouds, mountains, rivers, and trees, are better described by fractal geometry than by traditional Euclidean geometry. And fractals have a property called fractal dimension, a number that quantifies how much space the shape fills. And for a smooth curve, the dimension is 1. For a surface, the dimension is 2. But for fractals, the dimension can be a non-integer, like 1.2 or 1.5, indicating that the shape is more than a line, but less than a surface. And coastlines typically have fractal dimensions between 1 and 2, reflecting their intricate, space-filling character. The paradox has practical implications for geography and cartography, because if coastline length depends on measurement scale, then different measurements will give different answers. And there is no single correct answer to the question, how long is the coastline of Great Britain? The answer depends on what resolution of map you use, on what level of detail you include, and different countries and agencies use different conventions, sometimes specifying a minimum feature size or a standard ruler length. But these conventions are arbitrary, and different conventions give different lengths. And so coastline length is not an intrinsic property of the coastline, but a relational property that depends on the measurement method. The paradox also raises philosophical questions about measurement and the nature of geometric properties, because it suggests that some shapes do not have well-defined lengths, that the concept of length, which works well for straight lines and smooth curves, breaks down for irregular shapes, and this is not a limitation of our measuring instruments, but a feature of the shapes themselves. And this raises the question of whether length is a fundamental property of all curves, or whether it is a concept that applies only to sufficiently regular curves. And fractals fall outside the domain where traditional geometric concepts apply. Visualize the coast as an infinitely jagged line, with bays and headlands at every scale. Zoom in on a section and you see smaller bays and headlands. Zoom in again and you see even smaller ones. And this pattern repeats forever. There is no smooth coastline at any level of magnification, only more and more detail, and so tracing the coast means following an infinitely intricate path, and the length of an infinitely intricate path is infinite. And this is the essence of the paradox, that complexity at all scales produces infinite length, that irregular shapes are fundamentally different from regular shapes, and that traditional geometry is inadequate to describe them. The coastline paradox also appears in other contexts, in measuring the length of borders between countries, in measuring the perimeter of cells or the surface area of lungs, both of which exhibit fractal-like structure with increasing detail at smaller scales. And in all these cases, the measured value depends on the scale of measurement, and there is no single correct answer, only a family of answers indexed by measurement resolution. And this multiplicity is not an error or a limitation, but a feature of the geometry, a reflection of the fact that irregular shapes do not have simple scalar properties like length or area in the traditional sense. The mapmaker gives up, unable to provide a single definitive number for the coastline length, or provides multiple numbers with caveats about measurement scale, and the coastline stretches around the island, infinitely detailed, infinitely long if measured with infinite precision, and the paradox remains a reminder that geometry is more complex than Euclid imagined, that natural shapes do not conform to circles and straight lines, that measurement depends on scale, and that some questions like how long is the coastline do not have simple answers, and Mandelbrot's fractals provide a framework for understanding this complexity, for describing and quantifying irregular shapes, and for recognizing that the world is full of structures that are neither one-dimensional nor two-dimensional, but somewhere in between. And the paradox endures, a touchstone in fractal geometry, a demonstration that infinity appears not just in abstract mathematics, but in concrete measurements of real physical objects, and the coastline remains, jagged and intricate, defying simple measurement, a natural fractal that reveals the limits of traditional geometry and the need for new mathematical tools to capture the complexity of the world. The bystander effect. Why more witnesses mean less help. A woman screams in the street, attacked by an assailant, stabbed repeatedly over the course of 30 minutes. And dozens of neighbours hear the screams, look out their windows, witness the attack, and no one calls police, no one intervenes, no one helps, and the woman dies while witnesses watch. And this is the murder of Kitty Genovese in 1964, an event that shocked the public, that seemed to reveal something disturbing about urban indifference, about human nature, and psychologists John Darley and Bib Latane investigated, conducted experiments to understand why bystanders fail to help, and their research revealed the bystander effect, the paradoxical finding that the presence of other witnesses decreases the likelihood that any individual will help, that the more people who witness an emergency, the less likely anyone is to intervene. And this contradicts common sense, which suggests that more witnesses mean more help, mean more potential helpers. But the psychological reality is opposite, is that responsibility diffuses across bystanders, that each assumes someone else will help. That pluralistic ignorance emerges where everyone looks to others to define the situation, and everyone concludes it must not be serious because no one else is acting, and the bystander effect reveals how social dynamics can produce collective inaction, can create situations where groups of people fail to help when any individual alone would help. And the effect has been replicated across hundreds of studies, has been demonstrated in contexts from emergencies to everyday helping, and understanding the bystander effect has practical implications for promoting helping behaviour, for overcoming diffusion of responsibility, for recognising that crowds do not guarantee help but often prevent it. Imagine witnessing an emergency. Someone collapses on the sidewalk, and you are alone, and your responsibility is clear, is unambiguous. There is no one else who could help, and so you help. You call for medical assistance, you check if the person is breathing, you do what you can, and the situation is straightforward. Responsibility is concentrated, is entirely yours. But now imagine the same situation in a crowded plaza. Dozens of people are present, all witness the collapse, and now responsibility is diffused, is distributed across all present, and you reason that someone else will help, that someone with more expertise will intervene, that surely someone has already called for help, and you look to others to see how they are reacting, and they are not panicking, are not rushing to help. And so you conclude perhaps the situation is not serious, perhaps the person is drunk rather than injured, perhaps help is not needed, and everyone reasons this way. Everyone diffuses responsibility, everyone looks to others and no one helps. And the person lies there untended while a crowd watches. And this is the bystander effect in action, the paradoxical result that more witnesses produce less help. The bystander effect demonstrates several psychological mechanisms: diffusion of responsibility, where the presence of others makes each individual feel less personally responsible; pluralistic ignorance, where everyone looks to others to define the situation, and everyone's inaction convinces everyone else that the situation is not serious; evaluation apprehension, where people fear being embarrassed if they help inappropriately, fear looking foolish if they misinterpret the situation; and audience inhibition, where the presence of others makes people self-conscious, makes them less willing to act. And these mechanisms combine to suppress helping behaviour, to create barriers that are stronger when more people are present, and the effect is not universal, is moderated by various factors, by the ambiguity of the situation, by whether the victim and bystander are similar, by time pressure, by the relationship between bystanders, but the basic pattern is robust, is well established. More bystanders generally mean less help. Visualize the effect as an inverse relationship. As bystanders increase, helping probability decreases, and experiments show this quantitatively, show that when participants believe they are the only witness, they help more than 80% of the time. But when they believe there are 4 other witnesses, they help less than 40% of the time, and response time increases with number of bystanders. It takes longer to help when more are present, and these effects are not small, are not marginal, are dramatic reductions in helping behaviour caused simply by the presence of others. And the effect challenges the assumption that safety in numbers applies to emergencies, shows that crowds can be dangerous, not because they contain threats, but because they inhibit helping. One implication of the bystander effect is for personal safety. for recognizing that if you need help in an emergency, you should not appeal to groups, should not shout for someone to help, but should single out an individual, should point to a specific person and say, "You in the red shirt, call 911. And this direct assignment of responsibility overcomes diffusion, makes responsibility clear and concentrated, and significantly increases helping likelihood. And self-defense trainers teach this. Teach that calling for help requires specificity, requires breaking through the bystander effect by eliminating diffusion of responsibility. Another implication is for intervention training, for teaching people to recognize the bystander effect, to understand that their inaction contributes to collective inaction, that everyone assuming someone else will help means no one helps. An awareness of the effect increases helping behavior, increases intervention rates, and training programs that teach about the bystander effect and provide intervention skills show effectiveness, show that educated bystanders are more likely to help, are better at recognizing emergencies, are more willing to take responsibility, and many institutions now provide such training. Colleges offer bystander intervention programs. Workplaces train employees to intervene in harassment or discrimination, and understanding the psychology improves outcomes. The bystander effect also appears beyond emergencies, appears in everyday situations requiring minor helping. Someone drops papers and no one helps pick them up when many people are present. Someone struggles with a door and passers-by ignore them when others are around. And the effect generalizes, shows that diffusion of responsibility and pluralistic ignorance operate in low-stakes situations, not just in dramatic emergencies, and this suggests that the mechanisms are fundamental aspects of social psychology, are default responses to situations with potential helpers, and overcoming them requires conscious effort, requires recognizing the psychological barriers and deliberately choosing to help despite them. Some research questions the original Kitty Genovese narrative, suggests that the number of witnesses was exaggerated, that some witnesses did call police, that the story was sensationalized. And while the specific details are disputed, the bystander effect itself is real, is well documented, is not dependent on that one case, but is demonstrated across hundreds of experiments and real-world observations. And the effect remains one of the most robust findings in social psychology, remains a phenomenon that reliably occurs under controlled conditions. And questioning the Genovese case does not undermine the effect, does not invalidate the psychological mechanisms, but shows that public understanding of the case may be based on incomplete information. The effect also has limits, works differently in different cultures, is stronger in individualist cultures, and weaker in collectivist cultures, where group responsibility is more salient, is stronger in urban environments, and weaker in small communities where people know each other, is weaker when victims are similar to bystanders, when group identity is salient. And these moderators show that the effect is not inevitable, is not universal, but depends on social context, on cultural norms, on relationships. And this suggests intervention strategies, suggests that building community, creating shared identity, emphasizing collective responsibility can reduce the bystander effect, can promote helping even in groups. The woman lies in the street, bleeding, screaming, and windows light up. Faces appear, watch, and no one comes, no one calls. The witnesses assume others will help, assume the situation must not be serious if no one else is acting, and the bystander effect unfolds, responsibility diffuses, pluralistic ignorance emerges, and the woman dies while a crowd watches. And the tragedy reveals something about human psychology, reveals that helping is not automatic, is inhibited by social dynamics, is suppressed when others are present, and the bystander effect remains one of the most important findings in social psychology, remains a demonstration that individual helping decreases when groups are present, that crowds can be obstacles to help rather than sources of help. And understanding the effect is crucial for promoting intervention, for overcoming diffusion of responsibility, for ensuring that witnesses become helpers rather than passive observers. And the effect endures as a permanent warning about the social psychology of helping, about the paradox that more potential helpers often mean less actual help, and the lesson persists that helping requires overcoming social barriers, requires taking personal responsibility, despite the presence of others, requires acting when everyone else is watching and waiting. The Allais paradox. Maurice Allais, a French economist and Nobel laureate, presented a pair of choices in 1953 that revealed a systematic pattern of preferences violating the independence axiom of expected utility theory, and this became known as the Allais paradox, one of the most influential demonstrations that human decision-making deviates from the prescriptions of standard rational choice theory. And the paradox shows that people's preferences can be influenced by irrelevant alternatives, by outcomes that occur in both options and should therefore cancel out, yet somehow affect which option is chosen. The first choice involves two lotteries. Lottery A offers a certain gain of $1 million, while Lottery B offers a 10% chance of winning $5 million, an 89% chance of winning $1 million, and a 1% chance of winning nothing. And when faced with this choice, most people prefer Lottery A, the certain million, preferring the sure thing to the gamble, even though the gamble has a higher expected value. And this preference reflects risk aversion, a common and generally accepted feature of human decision-making. The second choice involves two different lotteries. Lottery C offers an 11% chance of winning $1 million and an 89% chance of winning nothing, while Lottery D offers a 10% chance of winning $5 million and a 90% chance of winning nothing. And when faced with this choice, most people prefer Lottery D, the gamble with the higher potential payoff, accepting the slightly lower probability of winning in exchange for the much larger prize. The paradox emerges when these two preference patterns are analysed together, because the independence axiom of expected utility theory requires that if Lottery A is preferred to Lottery B, then Lottery C should be preferred to Lottery D. And the reason is that Lotteries A and B differ from Lotteries C and D only in that there is an 89% chance in both A and B of receiving $1 million, and in both C and D this 89% outcome is replaced with winning nothing, and this replacement should affect both lotteries equally, should not change the preference order, because the independence axiom says that preferences between lotteries should depend only on outcomes where the lotteries differ, not on outcomes that are the same in both. And the 89% probability mass is shifted in the same way for both pairs, and so if you prefer A to B, you should also prefer C to D. And if you prefer D to C, you should also prefer B to A. The typical pattern of preferences, A over B and D over C, cannot be represented by any utility function satisfying the expected utility axioms. And so the Allais paradox demonstrates that people systematically violate the independence axiom, that their preferences are sensitive to common outcomes in ways that expected utility theory does not permit. And this violation is robust, appearing in experiments with diverse populations, with real monetary stakes, with careful experimental design, and the paradox cannot be dismissed as error or confusion, but represents a genuine feature of human decision-making. The paradox has inspired alternative theories that can accommodate the observed preferences, including prospect theory, developed by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, which modifies expected utility theory by introducing reference points, by treating gains and losses differently, by allowing for probability weighting where people overweight small probabilities and underweight large probabilities. And these modifications can explain the Allais preferences, because in the first choice, the certainty of $1 million receives extra weight, making Lottery A more attractive, while in the second choice the small probabilities are overweighted, making the 10% chance of $5 million in Lottery D seem more appealing than the 11% chance of $1 million in Lottery C. Other theories include regret theory, where people anticipate the regret they would feel if they made the wrong choice. And this anticipated regret influences preferences in ways that violate independence, because the certain million in Lottery A avoids the regret of choosing the gamble and losing everything, while the choices between C and D do not have this asymmetry. And rank-dependent utility theory, which generalizes expected utility by allowing the utility of lotteries to depend not just on outcomes and probabilities, but on the rank ordering of outcomes, and this allows for preferences that violate independence while maintaining other desirable properties. The Allais paradox raises normative questions about rationality. Some argue that the independence axiom is a fundamental requirement of rational choice, that violating it leads to incoherence, to preferences that can be exploited through Dutch books or money pumps, to decision-making that is systematically suboptimal, and that people who exhibit Allais preferences are making mistakes and should revise their preferences to conform to expected utility theory. While others argue that the independence axiom, while mathematically convenient, is not a necessary condition for rationality, that it does not capture important aspects of how people value uncertain prospects, that preferences like those in the Allais paradox reflect legitimate concerns about certainty, regret, and the context of choice, and that we should revise our normative theories to accommodate these preferences rather than dismissing them as irrational. The paradox also has practical implications for economics and policy, because if people systematically violate independence, then markets may not function as standard theory predicts. Risk preferences may be context-dependent. Insurance and investment decisions may be influenced by framing effects, and policies designed to maximize expected utility may not align with what people actually prefer. And understanding these deviations from expected utility helps explain phenomena like the equity premium puzzle, the disposition effect, and other anomalies in financial markets and economic behavior. The lotteries sit before you, the choices must be made, and your preferences, revealed through your choices, tell a story about how you value certainty and risk, about how you weigh probabilities and outcomes, and the story violates the axioms of rational choice, violates the clean mathematical structure of expected utility theory, and yet the choices feel reasonable, feel justified, feel like they reflect something important about value and uncertainty that the theory misses, and the paradox persists. The gap between theory and behavior remains. The independence axiom is violated again and again in experiments and in life, and decision theorists must choose. Either insist that the axiom is normatively binding and that violators are irrational, or acknowledge that the axiom is too strong, that rational choice is more complex than expected utility allows, and that new theories are needed to capture the richness of human decision-making. And the Allais paradox remains a landmark, a decisive demonstration that classical rational choice theory does not fully describe or prescribe human behavior, a challenge that spawned new theories and new research programs, and a reminder that rationality is contested, that what counts as a reasonable choice depends on assumptions and frameworks that are themselves open to question, and the lotteries remain, the choices remain, the preferences remain, and the paradox endures, unsolved in the sense that no consensus has emerged about whether the preferences are rational or irrational, about whether we should revise our theories or our preferences, about whether independence is a negotiable axiom or a non-negotiable requirement. And the debate continues. Philosophers and economists and psychologists arguing about what rationality requires, about what humans actually do, and about the relationship between these two questions. The bald man paradox. A man stands before a mirror, his hair full and thick, and no one would call him bald, this much is certain. And yet time passes, and hairs fall, one by one, slowly at first and then with gathering speed. And the question that haunts philosophers is simple and unanswerable. At what precise moment does this man become bald, after which single hair crosses the threshold from not bald to bald, and the intuition rebels against the idea that one hair could make such a difference, that the removal of a single strand could transform a person's category, could change a truth about them in such a fundamental way. The bald man paradox is a version of the Sorites paradox, focused specifically on baldness, but illustrating the same underlying problem about vagueness, boundaries, and the limits of classification. And it asks us to consider whether baldness admits of sharp boundaries, or whether it is inherently vague, a matter of degree rather than kind. And if it is vague, then how can we use the term meaningfully? How can we say that someone is bald or not bald when there seems to be no clear line separating the two states? Imagine the process in reverse, starting with a completely bald man, hairless and smooth, and now a single hair appears on his head, and surely one hair does not make him not bald. The presence of a single hair is negligible, imperceptible to casual observation, and if one hair does not change baldness, then neither does two, and if two do not, then neither does three, and this reasoning continues, step by step, until the man has a full head of hair, and yet according to the logic he should still be bald because no single hair made the difference, and this conclusion is absurd, and so something must be wrong with the reasoning, but what? The paradox forces a choice between several uncomfortable positions. One option is to accept that there is a sharp boundary, a precise number of hairs that separates bald from not bald, perhaps 10,000 hairs or 5,000 or some other specific number, and anyone with fewer hairs than this threshold is bald, while anyone with more is not bald. And this view preserves classical logic, maintains that every statement is either true or false, that vagueness is merely epistemic, a matter of our ignorance about where the true boundary lies, but this position strikes many as implausible because it seems arbitrary. There is no principled reason why 10,000 hairs should be the cutoff rather than 10,001, and the idea that baldness depends on such a precise count feels wrong, disconnected from how we actually use the term. Another option is to reject the idea of sharp boundaries and embrace the view that baldness is genuinely vague, that there are borderline cases where it is neither determinately true nor determinately false that someone is bald, cases where the world itself does not settle the question, and this view requires abandoning or modifying classical logic, accepting that by valence, the principle that every proposition is either true or false does not hold for vague predicates, and this leads to various non-classical logical systems, three-valued logics where propositions can be true, false, or indeterminate, fuzzy logics where truth comes in degrees ranging continuously from 0 to 1, supervaluationism, where a statement is true if it is true on all acceptable ways of making the vague term precise, and each of these approaches has costs and benefits. Each preserves some intuitions while sacrificing others. A third option is contextualism, the view that whether someone is bald depends on the context of utterance, on the standards and purposes operative in a given conversation or situation. And in one context, a man with 5,000 hairs might count as bald, while in another context only someone with fewer than 1,000 hairs would count. And this view makes baldness relative rather than absolute. And it explains why borderline cases feel uncertain, because in borderline cases the context has not provided enough information to determine which standards apply, but contextualism faces challenges too. It must explain how context determines standards, whether there are constraints on what standards can be operative, and whether contextualism avoids the Sorites paradox or merely relocates it to the question of when contexts shift. The bald man paradox also connects to broader questions about language, reference, and the relationship between words and the world. Because if most predicates in natural language are vague, and they are, nearly every adjective and many nouns admit of borderline cases, then vagueness is not a peripheral issue, but a central feature of how we communicate, and any theory of meaning must account for it, must explain how. Vague terms can be useful and informative despite their lack of sharp boundaries, and must address whether vagueness is a feature of language, of thought, of the world, or of all three. Some philosophers argue that vagueness is purely linguistic, that the world itself is precise and determinate, but our words are blunt instruments that fail to carve reality at its joints, while others suggest that vagueness exists in thought as well, that our concepts are themselves fuzzy, and still others propose that the world itself contains vague objects and properties, that reality does not always come with sharp boundaries, that nature is continuous and gradual in ways that resist precise classification. The paradox has practical implications as well. In law, where terms like reasonable and substantial and significant must be applied to real cases despite their vagueness. In medicine, where diagnostic criteria often involve thresholds that are somewhat arbitrary. In ethics, where drawing lines between permissible and impermissible actions may require confronting borderline cases where intuition provides no clear guidance. And in each of these domains, the bald man paradox is not merely an abstract puzzle, but a genuine obstacle to clear thinking and fair judgment. The paradox also raises questions about personal identity and change over time. Because if baldness is gradual, then so are many other properties, aging, growing, learning, and if there are no sharp transitions, then perhaps personal change is also vague. Perhaps there are cases where it is indeterminate whether someone is the same person they were years ago, whether they have changed in significant ways or remained essentially the same. And this connects to deeper issues about persistence, continuity, and what it means to endure through time. The bald man stands as a symbol of all borderline cases, all situations where reality resists the either-or structure of classical logic, where predicates fade gradually from clear application to clear non-application, passing through a twilight zone where truth becomes uncertain, and the paradox endures because it exposes a tension between the precision we expect from rational thought and the vagueness inherent in the world and in language, and no solution has won universal acceptance. Philosophers continue to debate whether to accept sharp boundaries, revise logic, relativize truth to context, or adopt some more radical approach. And the bald man remains poised between categories. Neither clearly bald nor clearly not bald in the borderline cases, a living embodiment of the limits of definition, a reminder that the world does not always cooperate with our desire for clarity, and that some questions may have no determinate answer, not because we lack knowledge, but because the questions themselves presuppose a precision that reality does not provide. And the hairs fall one by one, and baldness approaches, and no single hair marks the moment of transformation, and the paradox persists, unresolved and perhaps unresolvable, a permanent feature of the conceptual landscape we must navigate, a crack in the foundations of logic that cannot be sealed. Quine's Gavagai problem? Why we can never know what anyone really means. An anthropologist arrives in a remote village to study an unknown language, a language no outsider has encountered before. And the anthropologist has no translator, no dictionary, no common linguistic framework, only observations and patience, and the method is radical translation. Learning the language from scratch by observing how natives use words in response to events. And one day, a rabbit runs past and a native points and says Gavagai, and the anthropologist writes in the notebook, Gavagai means rabbit. And this seems reasonable, seems like an obvious inference. The native saw a rabbit and said Gavagai, so Gavagai must refer to rabbits. But philosopher Willard Van Orman Quine points out a problem, a deep problem about meaning and translation. Because Gavagai might mean rabbit, but it might also mean undetached rabbit part, or rabbit stage, or collection of rabbit molecules, or instance of rabbithood. And all these translations are consistent with the native's behaviour. All would lead the native to say Gavagai in exactly the same circumstances, whenever a rabbit is present, and there is no fact of the matter, No objective truth about which translation is correct. No way to determine what gavagai really means. And this indeterminacy is not due to practical limitations, not due to insufficient evidence, but is fundamental, is a consequence of how meaning works. And this is Quine's gavagai problem, also called the problem of indeterminacy of translation, a challenge to the idea that words have determinate meanings, that translation has right answers, and that we can know what others mean when they speak. Imagine trying to distinguish between gavagai means rabbit and gavagai means undetached rabbit part. And you point to the rabbit and the native says gavagai, and you point to the rabbit's ear and ask whether this is gavagai, and the native responds, but you do not know whether the response means yes because the ear is an undetached rabbit part, or no, because the ear is not a whole rabbit, or something else entirely. And every test you design, every question you ask, can be interpreted in multiple ways, can be answered consistently by multiple translations, and no amount of observation, no behavioral evidence can definitively settle which translation is correct, because the native's behavior under all possible circumstances is compatible with multiple interpretations. And Quine argues that this shows meaning is indeterminate, that there is no fact about what gavagai really means, only different translation manuals that work equally well, that map the native's language onto ours in different but equally legitimate ways. The problem generalizes beyond anthropology to all understanding of language, because even when we share a language, even when we both speak English, the gavagai problem applies. We cannot be certain that we mean the same thing by our words, that rabbit means to you what it means to me. We might be using different concepts, carved up differently, but our behavior is similar enough that we never notice the difference. And this raises the disturbing possibility that communication is always partial, always approximate, that we never fully understand each other, that meaning is not something objective that words have, but something we impose through interpretation, and different interpretations can fit the evidence equally well, and there is no transcendent perspective from which to judge which interpretation is correct. Visualize meaning as a relationship between words and world, and Quine's point is that this relationship is underdetermined by behavior, by the evidence available to translators, because infinitely many relationships are consistent with the same behavioral evidence. Infinitely many ways of mapping words to world produce the same observable patterns, and choosing among these possibilities requires going beyond evidence, requires making decisions that are not forced by facts, and these decisions constitute meaning rather than discovering it. And so meaning is partially conventional, partially stipulated, not fully determined by reality. The gavagai problem challenges referential theories of meaning, theories that say words mean things because they refer to objects in the world, because rabbit refers to rabbits, and water refers to water, and Quine's argument shows that reference is inscrutable, cannot be determined from behavior alone, because words can be interpreted as referring to different things, different ways of carving up reality, and all interpretations fit the evidence, and so reference is not an objective relation, but is relative to a translation manual, relative to a scheme of interpretation, and different manuals. Different schemes can assign different references to the same words while remaining equally correct. One response to the gavagai problem accepts the indeterminacy, embraces it as a truth about meaning, argues that Quine is right, that there is no fact of the matter about what words mean beyond what is determined by behavioral evidence, and meaning is holistic, depends on the entire network of beliefs and language practices. And translation manuals are theoretical frameworks that organize this evidence. And like all theories, they are underdetermined by data, and multiple theories fit the same data equally well. And choosing among them involves pragmatic considerations, simplicity, utility, coherence, but not truth in any absolute sense. And this response treats meaning as a human construction, something we create through practices rather than something we discover in nature. Another response denies the indeterminacy, argues that Quine's thought experiment is artificial, that in real translation situations additional evidence is available, evidence about intentions, about how speakers correct each other, about the structure of their conceptual schemes. And this additional evidence narrows down the possibilities, rules out bizarre interpretations like undetached rabbit part, and determines that gavagai means rabbit in the ordinary sense. And while perfect certainty may be impossible, practical determinacy is achievable, and meaning is objective enough for communication to succeed, for translation to have right and wrong answers. And the gavagai problem is an epistemological worry, a concern about how we know what words mean, but it does not show that words lack determinate meanings, only that discovering those meanings is difficult. A third response appeals to charity, to the principle that we should interpret speakers as making sense, as having coherent beliefs, as speaking truly most of the time. And this principle constrains translation, rules out interpretations that make speakers irrational or massively mistaken. And while charity does not uniquely determine translation, it narrows the range of acceptable interpretations, and combined with simplicity and other pragmatic virtues, it makes translation tractable, makes it possible to arrive at good translations, even if not perfect ones. And this response treats translation as an interpretive practice, guided by norms rather than as a purely empirical investigation, guided only by behaviour. The gavagai problem also connects to broader philosophical issues about realism and anti-realism, about whether there are objective facts independent of our theories and languages. Because if meaning is indeterminate, then perhaps reality itself is indeterminate. Perhaps there is no fact about whether rabbits or undetached rabbit parts exist, only different ways of organising experience, different conceptual schemes that carve up the world differently. And Quine's ontological relativity, his claim that what objects exist is relative to a language or theory, follows from the gavagai problem, from the recognition that reference is inscrutable, that we cannot say what exists absolutely, but only what exists relative to a framework. The anthropologist sits with a notebook, the word gavagai recorded, the translation uncertain, and the native speaks, and the anthropologist interprets, and communication proceeds approximately, pragmatically, successfully enough for practical purposes, and whether gavagai really means rabbit or something else remains undetermined, remains a question without an answer, and Quine's problem persists, not as a practical obstacle to translation, but as a philosophical challenge to theories of meaning, as a demonstration that meaning is more elusive than we thought, more dependent on interpretation and less determined by facts. And the gavagai problem endures as one of Quine's most influential contributions, a thought experiment that changed how philosophers think about language, about meaning, about translation, and about the relationship between words and world. And the problem remains unsolved, perhaps unsolvable, a permanent feature of linguistic philosophy, a reminder that understanding each other is harder than it seems, that meaning is indeterminate, that communication is an achievement rather than an automatic consequence of shared language, and that the gap between what we say and what we mean, between our words and their reference, can never be fully closed. And the rabbit runs past and the native says, gavagai, and we translate approximately, hopefully, never quite certain that we have understood. Schrödinger's cat, the pet that's both alive and dead. A cat sits in a sealed box, a box that cannot be opened or observed from the outside. And inside the box with the cat is a device, a quantum mechanism that has a 50% chance of killing the cat within 1 hour and a 50% chance of leaving the cat alive. Perhaps a vial of poison that will break if a single radioactive atom decays. And the decay is a quantum event, genuinely random, with no way to predict whether it will happen in the next hour. And so after 1 hour has passed, the cat is either alive or dead. 50-50 odds. And this seems straightforward, But the paradox emerges when quantum mechanics is taken seriously, when the rules of quantum theory are applied consistently, because quantum mechanics says that before a measurement is made, before the box is opened and the cat is observed, the system exists in a superposition, a combination of both possible states simultaneously. And so the cat is both alive and dead at the same time, existing in a strange limbo where neither state is definite until observation collapses the superposition and forces the system into one state or the other. And this is Schrödinger's cat, a thought experiment devised by physicist Erwin Schrödinger in 1935 to illustrate what he saw as the absurdity of applying quantum mechanics to macroscopic objects to show that something was wrong with the standard interpretation of quantum theory. Imagine the situation step by step. At the beginning, the cat is alive, the radioactive atom has not yet decayed, and the quantum state is well defined. But as time passes, the atom enters a superposition of decayed and not decayed, because quantum mechanics describes it with a wave function that assigns amplitudes to both possibilities, and these amplitudes evolve smoothly, and the atom is in a state of quantum indeterminacy, neither definitely decayed nor definitely not decayed until a measurement is made. And this indeterminacy is not ignorance, not a matter of the atom being in one state or the other, and we just do not know which, but a genuine feature of quantum reality. The atom literally does not have a definite state until measured, and because the poison release is coupled to the atom's state, the poison is both released and not released, and the cat is both dead and alive, existing in a superposition of macroscopic states. And this conclusion seems absurd, seems to violate everything we know about cats and boxes and life and death, and Schrödinger intended it to be absurd, to show that something must be wrong with the orthodox interpretation of quantum mechanics, that the theory cannot be applied consistently to large objects, that there must be a boundary somewhere between the quantum realm where superpositions occur and the classical realm where objects have definite states. The paradox has generated an enormous amount of discussion and debate in physics and philosophy, with different interpretations of quantum mechanics offering different resolutions. The Copenhagen interpretation, the dominant view in Schrödinger's time, says that the wave function collapses upon measurement, that the act of observation forces the system into one definite state, and so when the box is opened and the cat is observed, the superposition collapses and the cat becomes definitely alive or definitely dead. But this raises questions about what counts as a measurement, about what constitutes an observer, about whether consciousness is required to collapse the wave function, or whether any physical interaction suffices. And these questions remain controversial, and the Copenhagen interpretation does not provide clear answers, does not specify where the quantum classical boundary lies. The many worlds interpretation offers a different resolution, saying that the wave function never collapses, that both outcomes occur, that the universe splits into two branches, one where the cat is alive and one where the cat is dead, and both branches are equally real. And the observer also splits, becoming two versions, one observing a live cat and one observing a dead cat. And each version believes they have observed a definite outcome. But from a global perspective, both outcomes happen. And the superposition is resolved not by collapse but by branching. And this interpretation avoids the measurement problem, avoids the need to specify what counts as a measurement. But it introduces other difficulties. The proliferation of parallel worlds, the question of what it means for both outcomes to be real, and whether this is a genuine solution or merely a reformulation of the problem. Decoherence theory provides another perspective, focusing on the interaction between the quantum system and its environment, and it shows that macroscopic objects, like cats, are constantly interacting with their surroundings, with air molecules, with photons, with thermal radiation, and these interactions cause the quantum coherence, the delicate phase relationships that allow superpositions to be destroyed very rapidly in a fraction of a second for macroscopic objects. And once coherence is lost, the system behaves classically, appears to be in one definite state. And so, the cat never actually exists in a superposition of alive and dead, or exists in such a state for only an immeasurably short time before decoherence converts it to a classical mixture, a probabilistic state where the cat is either alive or dead. We just do not know which until we look. And this dissolves the paradox by denying that macroscopic superpositions persist long enough to be observable. The paradox also raises questions about the role of consciousness in quantum mechanics, about whether an observer must be conscious to collapse the wave function, and some interpretations suggest that consciousness plays a special role, that the cat remains in superposition until a conscious being opens the box and perceives the outcome. And this view has been criticized as mystical, as importing mind into physics in ways that are unnecessary and unhelpful. And most physicists reject it, preferring interpretations that treat measurement as a physical process involving interactions with macroscopic devices, not requiring consciousness. But the question remains open, debated, unresolved, and Schrödinger's cat sits at the center of this debate, a symbol of the deep puzzles that quantum mechanics presents. Visualize the box, sealed and opaque, and inside the cat waits, and the quantum device ticks, and the atom hovers in superposition. And according to quantum mechanics, the entire contents of the box, the atom, the device, the poison, the cat, all exist in a superposition of two macroscopically distinct states: alive, cat no decay, and dead cat decay. And this superposition is described by a wave function that smoothly evolves, and the two branches of the wave function correspond to two different realities. And yet before the box is opened, there is only one box, one cat, one system. And the paradox is that quantum mechanics seems to say the cat is both alive and dead. While common sense says the cat is either alive or dead, we just do not know which. And this clash between quantum formalism and classical intuition is the heart of Schrödinger's cat, a paradox that has no agreed-upon solution, that different interpretations resolve in different ways, and that continues to drive research in the foundations of quantum mechanics. In efforts to understand what measurement means, what quantum states represent, and how the quantum world relates to the classical world we experience, the box sits on the table, the hour passes, and the cat's fate is sealed. Or is it? Or is the cat in limbo, suspended between life and death, waiting for observation to make reality definite? And the paradox endures, not because physicists do not understand quantum mechanics, but because quantum mechanics, understood correctly, leads to conclusions that seem impossible, that violate everyday experience, that force choices between interpretations that are empirically equivalent but conceptually divergent. And Schrödinger's cat remains the most famous illustration of this strangeness, a thought experiment that has entered popular culture, a paradox that symbolizes the weirdness of quantum reality. And the cat, alive and dead, real and hypothetical, continues to haunt physics and philosophy, a permanent reminder that the quantum world is not merely different in degree from the classical world, but different in kind, governed by rules that defy visualization and resist intuitive understanding. And the paradox persists, unresolved in the deepest sense, a puzzle that reveals the limits of human intuition and the challenge of making sense of a theory that works perfectly in practice but remains mysterious in principle. The Abilene paradox: why groups choose what nobody wants. A family sits on a porch in Coleman, Texas, on a hot afternoon, comfortable, playing dominoes, and the father-in-law suggests driving to Abilene for dinner, 53 miles away in a car without air conditioning. And the suggestion is not enthusiastic, is tentative, but the son-in-law says sure, sounds good, not because he wants to go, but because he assumes others want to go, and he wants to be agreeable. And the wife says yes if you all want to go, and the mother-in-law says of course, and they all pile into the car and drive to Abilene in dusty heat, arrive hot and tired, eat mediocre food, drive back exhausted, and sitting on the porch again, Someone admits they didn't really want to go, and then everyone admits they didn't want to go, admits they only agreed because they thought others wanted it, and the entire group took an action that no individual wanted, chose an outcome that everyone preferred to avoid. And this is the Abilene paradox, described by management professor Jerry Harvey, a phenomenon where groups make decisions that contradict the preferences of all members, where collective action diverges from individual preferences, not through majority rule or compromise, but through misperception, through failure to communicate, through assumptions about what others want. And the paradox reveals that agreement is not always consensus, that unanimous decisions can be unwanted by everyone. And the Abilene paradox shows a different kind of collective irrationality from Condorcet cycles or voting paradoxes. Shows irrationality that arises from social dynamics, from conformity pressure, from reluctance to dissent. And the paradox remains relevant for understanding group decision-making, for recognizing that groups can fail not just through conflict, but through false consensus, through everyone going along with what nobody wants. Imagine the psychology of each family member. Each sits on the porch comfortable, each prefers staying home, but each hears the suggestion and thinks, well, if someone is suggesting it, they must want it. I don't want to be the one who ruins everyone's plans. I should be agreeable. Go along, be a team player. And so each agrees despite preferring to stay, and no one voices their actual preference. No one says, I'd rather stay home. And the group collectively creates a false impression, creates the appearance of consensus when none exists, and everyone interprets others' agreement as reflecting genuine preference rather than social accommodation. And this mutual misperception drives the group toward an outcome no one wants. And the paradox unfolds. The trip is taken, the unwanted dinner eaten, and only afterward does truth emerge. Does communication clarify that everyone preferred staying home? And the group confronts the absurdity, the recognition that they did something no one wanted through failure to communicate authentically. The Abilene paradox differs from groupthink, where group members genuinely conform their preferences to the group, genuinely come to believe the group view. And Abilene involves no genuine preference change, involves only misperception, only assumption about what others want. And members maintain their private preferences, but suppress them out of social pressure, out of desire to be agreeable. And this suppression is the source of the paradox, creates the gap between public agreement and private preference, and the gap allows groups to pursue actions that everyone opposes. And breaking the paradox requires someone to voice dissent, to say, actually, I'd prefer not to go. And this dissent can reveal that others feel the same, can break the false consensus, but dissent is risky, is socially uncomfortable, requires challenging what appears to be group preference. And most people avoid this, prefer to go along, and the paradox persists. Visualize the Abilene paradox as a coordination failure, where the optimal outcome requires everyone to reveal their true preferences, requires honest communication, but social norms and psychological tendencies prevent this, create pressure toward agreement, toward accommodation, toward not rocking the boat. And these pressures are strongest when relationships matter, when group harmony is valued, when dissent risks social costs and family dinners and work teams and community groups all face Abilene risks. All can make decisions that no one wants, through false consensus, through failure to communicate authentically. And the paradox shows that agreement is not always good, that unanimous decisions can be wrong, that groups need mechanisms for authentic communication, need cultures that encourage dissent, need permission to disagree. One lesson from the Abilene paradox is the importance of honest communication, of creating environments where people feel safe expressing disagreement, where dissent is welcomed rather than punished. And organizations that suffer repeated Abilene paradoxes often have cultures of false harmony, have norms that discourage challenging proposals, have leaders who interpret dissent as disloyalty, and these cultures create conditions for Abilene, create pressure toward agreement, and preventing the paradox requires changing culture, requires valuing truth over harmony, requires encouraging people to voice concerns. And this is difficult, requires conscious effort, requires leadership that models disagreement, that rewards dissent, that avoids shooting messengers. Another lesson is about decision-making procedures, about how groups can avoid abilene through structured processes, through anonymous voting, through devil's advocate roles, through explicit checking for consensus, through asking not just who agrees, but who disagrees and why. And these procedures create space for dissent, create permission to voice opposition, and reduce pressure toward false consensus. And effective groups use these procedures systematically, build them into decision-making, recognize that surface agreement may hide opposition, and these procedures are especially important for high-stakes decisions, for commitments that are costly to reverse. And the trip to abilene is costly, is unpleasant for everyone, and could have been avoided with better communication. The abilene paradox also appears in organizational settings, in corporations where teams pursue strategies that no one really supports, in committees that adopt policies no member wants, in groups that invest in projects everyone privately doubts. And these organizational abilenes are costly, waste resources, damage morale, produce outcomes that serve no one's interests. And preventing them requires organizational awareness, requires training people to recognize abilene dynamics, requires creating cultures where speaking up is safe, where dissent is valued, and many organizations fail at this. Have cultures of deference, have hierarchies, where subordinates agree with superiors even when privately opposed. And these cultures are abilene-prone, create repeated paradoxes, and organizational effectiveness requires breaking these patterns. Some argue that the abilene paradox is overstated, that genuine cases are rare, that most group decisions reflect genuine preferences of at least some members, and while everyone agreeing despite everyone opposing is uncommon, partial abilene is more common, where some members oppose but remain silent, and the group pursues a course that a vocal minority supports while a silent majority opposes, and this partial abilene is still problematic, still produces suboptimal outcomes, and preventing it still requires encouraging dissent, requires creating safety for opposition. The paradox also raises questions about responsibility, about who is responsible when groups make decisions no one wants. And the answer is everyone and no one. Everyone contributed through silence, through false agreement, through failure to voice opposition, but no one individually caused the outcome. No one individually chose wrongly. Each made a reasonable social decision to accommodate perceived group preferences. And the collective outcome is worse than any individual action merited. And this shows how social dynamics can produce results that exceed individual culpability, can create group failures that no individual intended. And avoiding such failures requires collective awareness, requires group-level solutions, requires changing communication patterns and decision procedures. The family sits on the porch afterward, hot and tired and annoyed, and someone admits they didn't want to go, and the admissions cascade. And everyone realizes the absurdity, realizes they collectively did something no one wanted, and the abilene paradox is revealed, and laughter mixes with frustration, and the lesson is learned. The importance of honest communication, the danger of false consensus, the need to voice dissent, and the paradox remains a permanent reminder that groups can fail not just through conflict, but through excessive agreeableness, through mistaken assumptions about others' preferences, through social pressures that suppress authentic communication, and the abilene paradox endures as a cautionary tale about group decision-making, a demonstration that agreement is not always consensus, that unanimous decisions can be wrong, and that preventing collective irrationality requires creating environments where dissent is safe, where truth is valued over harmony, and where groups communicate authentically rather than accommodating falsely. Synesthesia. Paradox: why numbers have colours and sounds have tastes. A person looks at the number 5 and sees it as blue, not imagines it as blue, not associates it with blue, but actually sees blue, experiences colour as an intrinsic property of the number. And another person hears music and tastes chocolate, hears certain chords, and the taste appears involuntarily, automatically. And these experiences are synesthesia, are cross-modal sensory experiences where stimulation in one modality produces perception in another. And synesthesia is not metaphor, is not learned association, is a genuine perceptual phenomenon experienced by roughly 4% of the population. And the paradox is that synesthetes experience properties that are not physically present, see colours that are not in the stimulus, taste flavours that have no source, and yet these experiences are consistent, are reliable. The same numbers always evoke the same colours, the same sounds always evoke the same tastes, and this reliability distinguishes synesthesia from imagination or association, shows that synesthesia is automatic, is perceptual rather than cognitive, and the phenomenon reveals something fundamental about how the brain is organised, shows that sensory modalities are not strictly separate, but can communicate, can influence each other, and synesthesia represents an extreme of this cross-modal interaction, represents a neural architecture where connections between sensory areas are stronger than normal, are sufficient to produce conscious experiences in one modality when another is stimulated. Imagine being a grapheme colour synesthete, the most common form where letters and numbers evoke colours, and you read this text and every letter has its own colour. A is red, B is green, C is yellow, and the colours are vivid, are as clear as real colours, are not vague or imagined but are perceptually present. And when you see the letter A, you cannot help but see red. The colour is automatic, is triggered by the visual form of the letter, and this colouring happens for all letters and numbers, creates a richly coloured experience of reading. And while this might sound beautiful, it can also be distracting, can interfere with reading when the printed colours conflict with synesthetic colours, can create confusion. And yet for synesthetes, this is normal, is how the world has always looked. And they're often surprised to learn that others do not experience letters as coloured, that the colours are unique to synesthetes. Synesthesia demonstrates that perception is not modular, is not strictly segregated by sensory modality, and in synesthetes there is cross-activation. There are connections between sensory areas that do not exist or are weaker in non-synesthetes, and these connections allow activity in one area to trigger activity in another. And when grapheme area, the region that processes letter and number shapes, is activated, it also activates colour area, the region that processes colour, and this cross-activation produces the experience of coloured letters. And neuroimaging studies have confirmed this, have shown that when synesthetes see numbers, colour areas of visual cortex are activated, are lit up, and this activation is automatic, is bottom-up, is not produced by conscious thought or imagination, but is triggered by the stimulus itself. Visualize the brain as having sensory areas that are normally separate: visual area, auditory area, taste area, and these areas process their respective inputs and pass information to higher level regions. But in synesthetes there are additional connections. There are pathways between sensory areas that allow direct crosstalk, and these pathways are the neural basis of synesthesia, are what allows stimulation in one modality to produce experiences in another. And the connections are not learned, are not created through experience, but are developmental, are present from early life. And synesthesia is lifelong, is consistent. The same cross-modal experiences occurring throughout the synesthete's life. The synesthesia paradox is that these experiences are perceptual, are as real as any other perception, and yet the properties perceived are not present in the stimulus. The number 5 is not blue, is black on white, and yet the synesthete sees blue. And this challenges theories that say perception is veridical, is accurate, is a representation of physical reality. And synesthesia shows that perception can include properties that are not in the world, that are generated internally. And yet these properties feel external, feel like properties of objects rather than like internal mental states. And this raises questions about the nature of perception, about what it means for perception to be of something, about whether all perception involves some degree of construction, some degree of adding properties that are not in the stimulus. One theory of synesthesia is that everyone is born with extensive cross-modal connections, that infant brains have connections between all sensory areas, and during development, most of these connections are pruned or eliminated, and sensory areas become more segregated. And in synesthetes, some of these early connections are preserved, are not pruned, and this preservation allows the cross-modal experiences to continue into adulthood. And this theory is supported by evidence that infants show some synesthetic effects, show cross-modal correspondences, and that synesthesia runs in families, has a genetic component, suggesting that genes that regulate synaptic pruning are involved. Another theory is that synesthesia involves disinhibition, involves normally present connections between sensory areas that are usually inhibited, are suppressed, and in synesthetes this inhibition is weakened, is less effective, and so the connections are active, allow cross-activation, and this theory is supported by evidence that synesthesia can be induced temporarily in non-synesthetes through drugs that reduce inhibition, through hypnosis, through sensory deprivation, suggesting that the neural machinery for synesthesia is present in everyone, but is normally inhibited, and synesthetes have less inhibition, have more open channels between sensory areas. Synesthesia also has practical implications. Some synesthetes report that their experiences are useful, provide memory aids, make information more distinctive, easier to remember, and some musicians with sound-colour synesthesia report that the colours help with composition, with understanding musical structure, and some artists deliberately cultivate synesthetic experiences, use them as sources of creativity. And understanding synesthesia has implications for education, for recognising that people process information differently, that sensory experiences vary across individuals, and that teaching should accommodate these differences, should recognise that some students have richly coloured experiences of letters and numbers, while others do not. The phenomenon also raises questions about consciousness, about qualia, about the subjective properties of experience, because synesthetes have different qualia than non-synesthetes, have colour experiences that others do not, and this shows that consciousness is not uniform, is not the same across individuals, and qualia vary, and this variation is not just quantitative, is not just more or less of the same experience, but is qualitative, involves entirely different types of experience, and this challenges theories that say all consciousness is universal, is the same for everyone, and supports theories that say consciousness is individual, is constructed by each brain in potentially different ways. And synesthesia is one example of this variation, is one way that consciousness can differ. Some philosophers argue that synesthesia shows that perception is not representational, does not represent external properties, because the colours seen by graphema colour synesthetes do not represent anything in the world. The number 5 is not blue, and yet the colour is perceived, and this challenges representational theories of perception, suggests that perceptual experiences are not always representations of external properties but can be internally generated responses. And synesthesia is a case where the response includes properties that are not being represented, and this raises questions about what makes perception representational, whether all aspects of perception are representations or whether some are merely responses are produced by the perceptual system without representing anything external. The number appears black on white, and the synesthete sees blue, vivid, and automatic. The colour is as real as the number, is as perceptually present, and yet the colour is not there, is not in the stimulus, is generated by the brain, is a cross-modal activation, and the synesthesia paradox remains. Perception includes non-veridical properties, includes experiences that do not correspond to stimulus properties, and yet these experiences are automatic, are reliable, are as perceptually real as any other, and synesthesia endures as one of the most fascinating phenomena in neuroscience. A demonstration that sensory modalities are not strictly separate, that cross-modal connections exist, that perception can include internally generated properties, and that consciousness varies across individuals, includes experiences that are unique, that are not shared by everyone, and the colours remain overlaid on letters, triggered by sounds, evoked by tastes, and the cross-modal world of synesthetes continues, different from the world non-synesthetes perceive, richer in some ways, more confusing in others, and the phenomenon persists.